My name is Jeff Rogers. I am a lecturer in psychology at the Australian Catholic University in Sydney, Australia. And I'm going to talk to you guys today about the sort of science and the practice behind a particular area of psychology that we call neuropsychology. Just so I can make sure that everyone can hear me okay, can everyone just sort of wave that they can see me and hear me and everything is working all right? Great. I'm actually going to use that little wave as an example of where neuropsychology came from and what people in neuropsychology do. When you start to think about what just happened with that wave, a very basic, straightforward, kind of simple activity that we do pretty easily, pretty automatically, well, people in psychology get interested in how that actually happened and what are the different components that really made that wave come together. I'd like to start to think about some of the different things that needed to happen there. First of all, you guys needed to be able to see me. And when you saw me, what you saw made sense. It wasn't just some random lines and colors and motion, but you saw a person and you saw my arm moving and you also were able to hear me talking. And when you heard me talking, that didn't just sound like noise. It sounded like language to you, and it had meaning and it had understanding. You were able to receive a message from me, and after you saw that message and heard that message, you guys were then able to move your hands around. And the way you moved your hands around was in a way that you'd done before, doing an action that you understood and that you had some kind of little motor program for already. And all of that was probably stored somewhere in your memory. Now I noticed that no one is still waving their hands around anymore, even though I didn't say to stop. So all of you guys had some kind of self-control, and all of you guys had some kind of judgment about how long to wave your hand for, how high to wave your hand, how fast to wave your hand, and when to stop waving your hand. So you start to realize that something that seems really basic and really simple, like just waving your hand at someone, is actually a really complex activity requiring the kind of integration of a lot of different skills to make this behavior really come together. Now this is really where psychology and neuropsychology in particular come together. Neuropsychology is a branch of psychology. All of psychology is really pretty interested in just trying to figure out why people think the way they do, why people act the way they do, why they feel and behave the way they do. What makes neuropsychology a little bit different, though, is that we're really interested in the sort of relationship or the importance that our brains play in all of this. Our brains is sort of a neurological computer programming center that's driving all of this different activity. And when we're trying to look at this relationship between our brain and all of the behavior that we produce, as neuropsychologists, we're really interested in trying to not just describe, which is kind of what we just did with the wave, but we also want to be able to explain it. What parts of the brain are responsible for that? What made that work? What made it fail sometimes? And once we're able to describe and explain things, then we really want to help people optimize or get the most out of that relationship. So have the best memory they can possibly have. Improve their reasoning skills if something has gone wrong there. Help find a way to make someone's attention better if they're having problems with it. So where did all of this start from? Why do we get interested in the brain? What made neuropsychology kind of rise to the place it is now? Well, it actually goes back quite a long way, really back to the ancient Greeks and a number of different people, but Aristotle's name gets tossed around quite a lot. He was a pretty smart individual, spent a lot of time trying to describe some really interesting phenomena, and he took a stab at trying to explain where all of our behavior, where all of our mental skills come from. Now, to him, the brain didn't actually attract much attention. It was this big, lumpy, gray, soft thing just sitting inside of our skull, never doing anything. It didn't move, it didn't throb. Blood didn't really seem to be going there in any vast amounts. Not a whole lot seemed to be coming back out of it. What interested him was actually the heart. He liked the heart. It was big, it was bright, it was red, it was muscular, it was powerful. All sorts of stuff was coming in and out of it. It was right in the center of the body. So to him, that actually made the most sense. And this sort of interesting old diagram is just showing how he really felt the five senses, our sight, our hearing, our taste. I think he's poking himself to get some touch, or maybe getting bit by a snake there for that sense of touch. But really all of that was coming in through all of our sensory organs, but then instead of going to the brain, he thought that it was all coming back down to the heart. And that's where really the seat of our consciousness and our mental abilities was. Hasn't actually worked out that way, and we've started to shift our attention away from the heart. And we realized that actually there were a few people already before Aristotle and the ancient Greeks recognizing that the brain was important for something. And what we've got this based on is this concept called trepanation or trepanning. And what it refers to is these holes that have been drilled in the skull. These are our eyes and the hole for our nose and our mouth. Those are the natural ones. These are where someone has actually gone on and drilled holes in this person's skull. And we don't know precisely why every individual instance of drilling holes was done, but what we do know is that a lot of times this was done to people while they were still alive. And we know that because we can see, this isn't the best picture to describe it, but we can see evidence of these drill holes starting to heal back up again in some people's skulls, which means they must have been alive when this happened. Now, some of the records established that they were drilling holes to let spirits in, or perhaps to let spirits out, and it was all a little bit more sorcery and witchcraft than really neuropsychology. But actually a lot of times where we saw these drill holes was near the sites of big fractures to the skull bones. And what it looked like was that these are people that had probably been injured or attacked in a war or some horrible accident, and because of that blow to the head, they had gone in and deliberately drilled these holes as a really, really early form of sort of brain surgery or medical treatment. And someone must have been realizing that, hey, when you get hit in the head and you live through it, that's not really a good thing, and it's going to have some kind of negative impact on you. And perhaps if we drill a little hole around there and maybe let some of that swelling out or that blood out, because the brain will bruise just like our arm will bruise when we hit that really hard, and it might swell up and get tender and you'll see the pooling of blood in that bruise. Well, they were kind of doing the same thing here. So what we started to realize is that almost 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, people were in bits and pieces recognizing that there's something important going on inside that skull. That big gray lump is actually worth looking after and taking care of, because if something starts to go wrong with that big gray lump that we call a brain, then problems start to arise. So we've actually used brain injury quite a lot to advance our understanding of neuropsychology. And one of the earliest and most famous cases of brain injury and neuropsychology is the unfortunate story of Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas was born a few hundred, well, almost 200 years ago. It's coming up soon. And he grew up in New England in the United States, and he wasn't wealthy, he wasn't powerful, he was just kind of a normal, ordinary kind of guy. Average intelligence, well liked by his family and his friends, and in his mid-20s he found himself working as a foreman for the railroads. He was really good at his job. His employers gave him really good ratings, his co-workers really enjoyed working with him, he was a responsible foreman, he did his job well, he was reliable, he had good motivation, and one day he was out on the rail site and they were blasting, as they often do for the railroads, trying to lay track. And what they were doing that day was they were drilling holes deep into rocks, and they would then place charges deep into those holes, trying to get the charges deep into the hole as they could so they could blow up as much of the rock as possible. To make all of that happen, after you drilled the hole, someone then had to put all of the explosive powder deep into that hole. Now, the way they got the powder way into that deep hole was they used a rod, which you unfortunately see here in his head. But it was a long 2 or 3 meter rod, and they would pack the powder deep into this hole so that when the explosion occurred, it didn't occur out of the edge of the rock, it occurred way deep down in there. So as Phineas one day was packing the powder in with what they call this tamping rod, sorry I'm standing in the way of it, unfortunately the metal rod on a rock sometimes creates sparks. And Phineas had the unfortune of, as he was packing this powder deep into this rock, creating a spark, causing an explosion, and rather than blowing up the rock as they'd hoped, he instead sent this 2 or 3 meter metal rod straight back out the hole, up through his eye, and out through the top of his head. Now the photo is a bit gruesome and it suggests that the rod stayed in his head. That's actually not the case. The rod was probably going quite fast.
Just one moment, Barraville, you've just joined us. Could you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Good morning, Bowerville. We are talking about Phineas Gage, an unfortunate young man that managed to explode a big metal rod through his head a few hundred years ago while he was working on the railroads. So, as I was saying, the rod didn't remain in his head. This is more just for sort of theatrical purposes. It was probably traveling a couple 100 kilometers an hour, rushed through the bottom of his eye, out the top of his head, and was gone. Now, what makes Phineas Gage such an interesting story in neuropsychology is that he lived. This didn't kill him. Back then, a lot of things like this probably would have killed a person, but he survived, and he actually made quite a good physical recovery, much to the amazement of all of his co-workers that witnessed this rod go flying through his head, much to the amazement of the doctors that looked after him. It didn't happen quickly, but after a few months, Phineas was back on his feet, walking around, talking, didn't seem too badly affected. Brought him back to work, said, here you go, you were a foreman beforehand, love to have you back leading the railroad gang, come on back. When he came back though, people started to notice that this wasn't the same responsible, well-organized, mature 24, 25-year-old man that they had known a few months ago. He was a bit unpredictable, a bit erratic. He'd become quite disorganized. He could get quite upset and abusive, seemingly over very little small things, then calm down again very quickly, but then get really upset and expressive about something else a few minutes later. This unpredictability, this rudeness, this disorganization, this poor motivation that he showed at work, didn't sit too well with his colleagues, didn't sit too well with his bosses, so they had to let him go. They said, this is not the same employee that we used to have, something's really gone wrong. His intelligence was still there. He knew what he was supposed to be doing. His language was still there. He could still talk. He couldn't see out of this eye anymore. But to look at him physically, it was really unexpected that he would have all these dramatic personality changes. So he lost his job. He eventually started to fall out with his family. And after that, the track kind of goes cold on Phineas Gage. And he disappears for probably 5 or 6 years until we find him again somewhere in South America. No one really knows why he went to South America, what he was doing down there, but he spent the last few years of his life in South America. And it just really was kind of a very sad story of a gentleman who had probably been quite a successful young engineering foreman, who ended his life sort of lost somewhere down in South America with no friends, no family, and a very different personality than what he had in his days before this rod went through his head. And because he survived, it really gave us the first example of brain injury and what injury to particular parts of the brain will do when the person doesn't die from the injury, which had been happening with a lot of people up until then. So From this point on, doctors really started to pay more and more and closer attention to people that were surviving brain injury. And as they noticed that, oh, if this area of the brain or this part of the head has been hit really hard, we think that maybe this skill will get lost. And when people kept coming in with injuries to the back of their head, we kept noticing that their vision was getting disrupted. And like Phineas, when the front of their heads got damaged, we noticed that their planning and their problem solving and their judgment got disrupted. And so by slowly starting to piece together all of these horror stories of brain injury, we started to get a clearer idea of where some of these different skills were really coming from. Just like those skills that we were just trying to sort of dissect away from what put together to make our hands wave, we were starting to see, well, now that we know what the behaviors are, can we start to map them onto different areas of the brain? After Phineas, we actually had a lot more people than you might think we had to study and investigate, because we had 2 very large world wars. And as medicine improved, we had a lot more soldiers coming back with shrapnel, gunshot wounds, all sorts of horrible, nasty things happening to them in war that went through their heads that allowed them to still survive. And then they came back and were studied by doctors to start to put these sort of maps together. These days, we've gotten even more sophisticated, and we don't have to wait until someone explodes a big piece of metal through their head anymore to try and study how their brain functions. This is some of the newer stuff that's being done, and what it allows us to do is we can attach little fluorescent labels to all the different cells in our brain, and we can put different labels on things depending on what kind of chemical sort of composition those different cells in our brain have. And it starts to complete this really fantastic map showing all of the fibers and all of the connections and sort of the pathways and the freeways that information flows on inside of our brains. To give you sort of some kind of orientation, this would be the back of the head down here, and the eyes would be up here. Here's the top of our skull. But what we would have is our spinal cord coming up, and you can just see all of the fibers coming up the neck and then just branching out in all of this wonderful complexity all over the brain, and leading up to the tops and the fronts and out to the back, and all of these relay centers going on through the middle of the brain. So every day, every year, we're getting more and more sophisticated technologies to help us really look inside the skull and figure out what's going on in there. So what do we know about what's going on inside the skull these days? Well, we know that the brain is made up of these special kinds of cells, and they look different from the other kinds of cells that we have in the rest of our body. And because they look different, we've given them a different name, and we call them neurons. So these neurons, which is what this sort of thing is that kind of looks like it's attacking his head, but it's not meant to look that way. These neurons in our brain are the little building blocks and the little computer chips that really drive everything that we're thinking about and being able to do. So if we start to look across some of the other creatures around, we can see that probably our simple little friend the cockroach is running around with probably about 1 million neurons in its head. 1 million sounds pretty big, but when you start to think of how complex a cockroach's behavior gets, no language, probably no reasoning, some pretty sophisticated sensory abilities, but probably not starting a rock band or writing a chemistry paper next week. So 1 million neurons doesn't actually seem so crash hot. Go up to someone else, 1 billion neurons. Now that sounded like a big amount. That's what a cat's got. Cat's got about 1 billion neurons. And we know what cats are capable of. A little bit more emotion, a little bit more interaction, seem to have some fairly decent memories, still no language, not a lot of reasoning. So to get to what we're able to do, for a while we thought it was about 100 billion neurons. We've scaled that number back down a little bit in the last few years, but we think that we're probably running with about 84, 85 billion neurons. That is what makes up our brain. Quite a lot. Now, what makes it even more complex and really makes this whole system work is the fact that neurons have lots of branches, and they look kind of like trees. And all those branches of the trees can go and touch and link up with other neurons and all the branches of those. So what we end up with is with all of the branching from 84 billion neurons, they can probably form on the order of, they're thinking, no one's ever counted them yet, but thinking probably in the hundreds of trillions of connections. And that is just an overwhelming number of connections. And when you think of how we're doing with computers these days, the latest little Intel i7 quad processor is bragging that they've probably got about 730 million connections. The human brain is up in the hundreds of trillions. So we probably got a little ways to go yet before our iPhones replace us at work. But we're getting better. So how can we see all this stuff every day in clinical practice? Because we're not going to go back and count people's neurons every day to try and figure out how things are going. So some of the common technologies that neuropsychologists get to use and people practicing psychology is we can monitor the electrical activity of the brain. Every time we send signals between different neurons of the brain down all those different connections, we're actually doing a lot of that with little tiny electrical signals. And so we can put little sensors on the head, and they allow us to monitor those little electrical signals, and we can see where people are having a lot of activity in their brain. We can also take pictures of the brain. Just like an X-ray, we can just run some X-rays through the brain and get a picture of it. We can get a little bit more sophisticated and use something called an MRI. You might have heard that word before. And again, just different ways of taking pictures of the brain. It takes big, expensive equipment, but it works really well, and it gives us a really good snapshot of what's going on inside the skull. I mentioned that while we can record electrical activity, also these days, if you ask the person really nicely and you make sure you know exactly what you're doing, you can sometimes get permission to stimulate the brain. And that is, instead of recording electrical activity, we can actually send electrical activity into the brain and see what happens. If we send a little shock into the back, it might make it feel like you can see something in your vision. Or if we send something up to the top of your head, it might actually make your arm move a little bit. And then finally, one of the areas that we use a whole lot is observation. We just watch people. We watch them, we see what they're capable of doing, we set expectations, we give them tasks, and we see how they cope with those tasks. Honestly, this is what we spend a lot of our time doing in neuropsychology, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of today, is how we observe people. So some of the things that we might want to observe in neuropsychology, because we're interested in behavior, but we're interested in how the brain is influencing that behavior. So most of the time we're talking about brain injury. So something we might be interested in is after a head injury, like maybe a motor vehicle accident, has your judgment changed? Are you still thinking as well as you should be? Are you able to go back to school? Are you able to go back to work? We might want to look at something called dementia, which is what happens when you get older, and as your brain starts to unfortunately age and deteriorate, we call that dementia. And a lot of times one of the characteristic features of dementia is that our memory changes. And so neuropsychologists are always being asked to take a look at people that are aging and see if there's maybe a risk of dementia because their memory is starting to change. A few other things we can possibly look at. Concussion, that's just a fancy word for when you have a mild blow to the head. People that play sport, our AFL and our rugby players, they have concussions a lot, unfortunately, when they tackle each other and their heads hit the ground too hard. And a lot of times that has an impact on our attention and our concentration, so we look at that. Some people might have heard of something called a stroke, which is unfortunately when you have bleeding inside of your brain. And a lot of times that can have an impact on our ability to speak and put sentences together and understand language. So lots of different conditions that a neuropsychologist might study, and lots of different areas of behavior that we might be interested in trying to assess and give feedback on. So how might we do this? How would we assess some of those different abilities? Well, going back to our story of Phineas Gage, who we knew that after he had that rod go through the front of his head, something changed with his thinking, and his judgment didn't quite seem right anymore. And so we might have asked him, if he was alive today, a few questions to take a look at some of his reasoning skills. So have a shot at this. Think to yourself, how might a boat and a car be alike? Can we turn on the volume? Can anyone give me an answer what they think about how a boat and a car might be alike? Any ideas? Just shout it out. Turn on your microphones and shout out if anyone's got an idea. Okay, they have steering wheels. I heard power. I think they both run on power. And did anyone think of this? Did anyone think that they're both transport? They're both forms of transport. Try another one. How are a fly and a tree alike? The reasoning tasks get a little bit harder because we want to see just what people are capable of. Can anyone think of how a fly and a tree might be alike? It's a bit tougher. So this might have given Phineas Gage a few problems as well. People with dementia might have a problem with this. We'd say that they're both alive. They're both living things. So the reasoning task can get harder and harder and harder. We could also do another task where I say, I'm going to flash some red lights up here in these boxes. I want you to keep track of where the boxes were that lit up. So just follow this for a sec. And now think to yourself, can you remember the path? Can you point it out? Go ahead and point onto the screens that you guys have. Can you remember what the pathway was? And so we can use an activity like this to test someone's attention. And if they can do that one, we can do this one. I'm going to show you another pathway. And this time, can you trace it backward? And people usually find that a little bit more challenging. And it's just a bit more involved task of their attention and their concentration. And so neuropsychologists can use activities like this. We can test people's reasoning abilities. We can test their attentional skills to really get a pattern of what are their strengths and also what are their weaknesses. Are they good at memory? Do they have a really good memory for words, but not such a good memory for pictures? Is their attention okay, but only if it's things that they've read and not things that they've seen? Are their reasoning skills really not up to what they used to be, and maybe it's no longer appropriate to put them in charge, but they could be part of a team, just not the leader anymore? When we start to get these different patterns or these profiles of strengths and weaknesses or things that people are good at and not so good at, then we can make really practical recommendations. So for people your age, it might be about how can we help in the classroom? Should you be given extra time on a test? Would an aid be helpful? Would it be better if the teacher gave you your notes written down rather than just lecturing out loud to you? Just some of the really practical examples we can start to generate once we know what your strengths and weaknesses are. For people that are a bit older, that aren't in school anymore, then the recommendations start to become about what they can do at work, what kind of job they can do, and what they can do during the day with their lives. Are they still safe to drive a car? Are they still okay to look after paying the house bills? Are they okay with money, or are they going to make foolish mistakes or forget how much money they have? Are they going to forget where they left their car keys? Are they going to forget to pick up their kids that night? Do they need someone else giving them some support, either to help them drive or to help look after the house, to manage their finances for them? All of these are different questions that neuropsychologists get asked to consider after people have had a brain injury, like a stroke or dementia or a big sharp rod exploding through your head like old Phineas Gage. Finally, one of the last areas that neuropsychologists get involved in is trying to then improve these weaknesses. And when we try and improve those weaknesses, we call this rehabilitation. And some of you that might have maybe twisted an ankle or broken a leg before have maybe gone through rehabilitation where you walked on crutches and then you maybe went to the physiotherapist or the occupational therapist and they help you rehabilitate your broken leg or your sprained ankle by doing physical exercise. Well, we can do the same thing with cognitive or our thinking skills, where we can try and put you back through a rehab training program to build those abilities back up, or at least get them a little bit stronger, or help you find a different way to use what cognitive or thinking skills you do still have. Where do we work? What do we do? Well, a lot of us work in hospitals doing clinical work because that's where most of the people with brain injury end up. When you have a car accident, you go to the hospital, and while you're in hospital, well, that's where you'll see your neuropsychologist. Some of us that are really successful, we can go work in big fancy buildings downtown in Sydney and charge a whole lot of money, and we call that private practice. But that's basically the same idea as clinical work. We just don't have to work in the hospitals. We work in big fancy buildings. Or a lot of us, like myself, also spend a lot of time doing teaching and research at the universities. So we train up the next generation of psychologists and neuropsychologists, and we research and we try and find new ways of understanding the brain, new ways of exploring the brain, new ways of explaining what's going on after brain injury. So just to wrap up, really neuropsychology is about just trying to understand the brain and trying to understand how that brain is responsible for the way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way that we behave. And from that understanding, just trying to help people get back on their feet, recover from those accidents, from those surgeries, from those unfortunate sporting events, and to help them just lead fulfilling lives and do the best that they can do with whatever it is that they have.